Hello and Goenda, and welcome back to the Faroe Islands, the dramatic North Atlantic islands that are technically part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but are almost, just not quite entirely, their own independent country. And I am in central Tórshavn, in case that wasn't clear. Because today we're talking about the invasion and occupation of Denmark and the Faroe Islands in World War II, and why there is a startling difference between this Danish coin and this Faroese stamp. Now, both of these were released on the anniversary of the end of the war, and as you would expect, the Danish coin is celebrating the years of liberation, with a photo from May 1945. But the Faroese stamp, that's celebrating the years of occupation, with a photo from 1940. Which means those soldiers are the invaders. And there is, of course, a very good reason they've done that. The army who invaded the Faroe Islands was not Nazi Germany. This is the story of how being invaded by a different country changed everything. So our story begins in Denmark on the 9th of April 1940. In fact, at about 4:15 in the morning on the 9th of April 1940, because that's when Hitler gives the order for Nazi Germany to invade the country. And the Danish forces find themselves so completely outnumbered, outgunned and outmaneuvered that by 8:34 the government has already surrendered. In only a few hours, Germany has gained control of the whole country. Except, not quite the whole country. Because over here in the North Atlantic is a far-flung outpost of Denmark called the Faroe Islands. And back then, they're nothing like the self-governing, almost independent country that they are now. They're basically the Danish equivalent of a county, run by the Danish equivalent of a county councillor, a man from Copenhagen called Carl or Hilbert. But poor old Carl wakes up that morning to discover that Denmark is no longer in charge of Denmark, let alone the Faroe Islands. Which sort of raises the question, what do we do now? On one hand, you had Faroese pro-independence parties arguing for an immediate declaration of independence, and on the other hand, you had Carl insisting that he was still in charge, and they're doing absolutely nothing of the sort. And on the other hand, none of that is going to make the slightest bit of difference if the Nazis decide they want to invade. And 3 days later, the invasion begins. Except, it's not the Nazis, it's the British. On the 12th of April 1940, 2 British destroyers appeared on the horizon and sailed into the port of Tórshavn. It must have been a scary few moments for the residents of the Faroese capital, until they realised the boats were British and not German. But then the next question was, what were the British doing here? Well, from a British point of view, there was no way they could allow the islands to fall into the hands of the Nazis, which would give the enemy a strategic base for potential future attacks on Britain. But the only realistic way to stop that happening was if Britain invaded the islands instead, which is something they were now going to try to explain to the Faroese parliament. Hello? Never get the hang of these blasted things. Hello, it's the Royal Navy here from Britain. Terribly sorry to bother you. We just need to invade and occupy your country, briefly. Because otherwise, we suspect the Germans will do it instead, which would be bad news for you, and also bad news for us. So we've brought a couple of destroyers with us, and we've got the HMS Suffolk on the way, with a couple of hundred troops and a few guns. But don't worry, carry on what you're doing, this is only a temporary invasion, and we shall hand you back to the Danish king as soon as we've finished the war. Now, perhaps understandably, this provokes an emergency meeting of the Faroese Parliament, with some members still trying to push through a vote on independence, and others arguing that maybe right now it was best to just collaborate with the British. And in the end, the majority voted to accept the terms of the British occupation, with a few important conditions. Number 1, that the invasion was definitely only temporary. Number 2, the British would only be in charge of military matters. And number 3, the Faroese would be left in charge of actually running the country. To which Britain said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. You're thinking of 19th century Britain." One day later, the HMS Suffolk arrived, entered the port, and disembarked the troops here, in central Tórshavn. I actually don't know where they disembarked. Somewhere around here. And so began one of the politest and friendliest military occupations of all time. The British forces set up their headquarters here at the historic Skansin fortress, where they took one look at the existing defence system and gave it a bit of a 20th century upgrade. But as more British soldiers began arriving, most of them army members who came to replace the initial force of Navy Marines, British troops ended up spreading all over the islands, building camps, defences, and even an airbase to fight off the occasional attack from the Luftwaffe. So, how did the locals feel about all of this? Well, generally speaking, the Faroese people got along very well with their friendly invaders. By which I mean about 170 of them ended up getting married. But more seriously, the two sides knew they had to work together here. The Faroese could not have defended the islands without British support, but the British couldn't have done it either without the help of the Faroese fishing crews, who were risking their own lives among rough seas, minefields, and German boats in order to keep the vital supply lines going. This was a great example of wartime collaboration, but in a good way. And eventually, the threat of Nazi invasion begins to diminish, to the point where, in the later years of the war, the Faroe Islands were by all accounts quite a nice place to be sent to. British soldiers would often find themselves welcomed into Faroese homes and given cooked meals, and in return they would supply their hosts with tea and biscuits and British chocolates. So by the time May 1945 rolls around, and most of Denmark is celebrating liberation from their invaders, the Faroe Islands are almost sorry to see their ones going home. Almost. Let's be honest, although Britain had left the islands with upgraded defences, a brand new airport, and a mild addiction to Cadbury's, what the Faroe Islands really liked about the invasion was, ironically, the freedom it had given them. Because while Copenhagen was otherwise occupied, literally, this was the first time in more than a century the Faroe Islands had been free to manage their own affairs, speak their own language in their own parliament, and fly their own flag. And now the war was over, they had no intention of going back to being just a Danish county again. The Faroe Islands had shown they were ready to go it alone and govern themselves. And even the King of Denmark was willing to recognise that. I say willing. It took 3 years of negotiations and one cancelled independence vote, but in 1948 he agrees to give the Faroe Islands home rule. It wasn't quite the full independence that some Faroese people wanted, but they were now officially a self-governing country and separate from Denmark, while technically remaining part of what's called the Kingdom of Denmark. And the Faroe Islands have kept their special status ever since, which gives them a Faroese Prime Minister with a Danish royal family, Faroese passports with Danish citizenship, and freedom to do their own Faroese thing with Danish military protection, in case anyone else tries to invade them. So is this arrangement actually quite a good compromise, or would they be better off independent? Well, the population is very split on that question, even if you ask a pro-independence politician. But what really matters is they are free to make the decision themselves, as confirmed here by the Danish Prime Minister. And that's why the Faroe Islands still fondly remember the part that was played in gaining that freedom by their friendly occupiers in World War II. And that is how the Nazi invasion of Denmark led to the widespread availability of British biscuits in the Faroe Islands. History's weird sometimes, isn't it? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this story. There is so much more that I could have talked about, like how the British also ended up invading Iceland, and why we are nowhere near as fondly remembered there as we are in the Faroe Islands. But this video has already taken me far too long to make, and at some point I need to go outside and make some other ones. So the next few videos on this channel will likely be shorter and sillier ones, where I'll be trying to avoid serious topics like war and politics. The world already has far too much of those going on at the moment. Meanwhile, if you'd like to visit any of the locations featured in this video, they can all be found in central Tórshavn, in case that wasn't clear. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.